Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our Journalism After Snowden programme here at the museum. And thank you very much indeed for the panelists of the previous session setting up, I think, what will be a really fascinating discussion in this part of the programme, where we hear from leading editors who work every day with the powers that be in the land and who have to protect the journalists that we've been talking about next door. A year ago, we set ourselves the challenge at the Tower Centre to run a programme of work which tried to make sense in a journalistic context of the revelations that Edward Snowden did us a favour by bringing to the public via the conduits of The Guardian, the Washington Post, the New York Times, ProPublica, and others. It's really been a very long and rich year. We've convened discussions between lawyers, technologists, journalists. We've even had a go occasionally at engaging the government with less success, but we hope they'll join the conversation if any of them are here this evening. And we're just beginning, I think, to understand the challenges of a world where data and privacy are a pressing human rights issue, where the free press is no longer in control of its own means of distribution and reliant on third-party technologies. For Journalism After Snowden, we're extremely grateful for the support of the Knight Foundation and the Tower Foundation, who rapidly backed our plan to do this, which enabled us to really develop a program that was completely timely. Also, it's great to work in a school where you're very supported in this work, and I want to thank Paul Neely, who is somewhere here, who's our chair of our board of visitors. Paul was also a key motivator in getting the Tower Centre, for which I'm director, off the ground. So I guess I should thank you as well, Paul, though at times like this I'm not quite sure to what extent, what exactly it is I've taken on. We're finishing the programme, the year-long programme here tonight, but as I've said before and I say it again, it feels like we are just beginning. We're also very fortunate to work in a university which is led by a leading First Amendment scholar and someone who has a deep interest in all of these issues. So I'd just like to welcome to the podium our President, Lee Bollinger.
Thank you very much, Emily. Let me just say a few people I'd like to recognize and then just say a few things about the issues for tonight. Emily is one of the gifts that the university has received in the past few years, to have somebody of her journalistic reputation and achievement, and then come into the academy and work with people all over the institution has really been extraordinary. And the Tow Center is right where the action is, and Len Tow is one of our great partners throughout the university, but especially in this one, and we're always grateful to him. Phyllis Mailman, who's sitting next to him, is a great benefactor of the institution and friend as well. Alelia Bundles is a trustee, and Alelia and I on the trustees of Columbia try to hold up the journalism end of the institution. Steve Coll is just a gifted journalist, and we were so lucky to be able to recruit him to be the dean, the successor to Nick Lemon. Fantastic job that he has done. And the school itself is a gem. It's the only one in the Ivy League. It's, in my view, makes no sense to have a university and not have a journalism school. Journalism and universities, journalists and professors do exactly the same thing, just at sort of different scale and different time period, but we're all interested in the public interest and trying to advance information and knowledge. And the school has done that, just like it's doing in this very important issue. Just a couple of comments on the issue. I, of course, teach every year. I write about Pentagon Papers. That is one of the most interesting areas of, I think, constitutional law and public policy. It's not your usual kind of system that's been set up. Think about something like defamation or obscenity. You do the balancing and you figure out what, the harm to the society and where you're going to draw the line, the importance of freedom of speech, and then you draw the line. And it may be vague and it may be hard to actually apply, but you have a norm, you have a doctrine. In this area, it's, I think, much more complicated because every society has to figure out the balance between the security for the nation and for the values of the nation, and the interest of the public in knowing what's going on. And that's a very complicated thing to do. You might want to say that every piece of information that the government has will be subject to disclosure, maybe even as a constitutional rule. That argument has been tried and it's failed. It would have to be subject to endless disputes before courts, and courts would have to make the judgment. You might say that the journalists who get their hands on information from employees who leak it to them should not be able to publish that. We didn't say that. We said something really much more complex. So the leakers, government can do whatever it needs to do, wants to do, to keep information from the public as a matter of constitutional law. But some people may leak. And they may leak to journalists, of course, and then the government can go after the leakers, and there's no constitutional right of the leakers. But the press, if they get the information, even knowing that it's been illegally taken, have the protection against prior restraints. That's what Pentagon Papers is. But Pentagon Papers and prior restraints is not the full story, because you may be free of an injunction as a result of that case, and that's even qualified. But the case does not officially, formally speak to the question whether you can be prosecuted after you publish it, which of course is a very great concern to journalists. So it's left in this kind of limbo, and then there are the customs. The government doesn't go after leakers as rigorously as it might. The press doesn't publish everything that it might. There's a kind of accommodation that's worked out. The government does not try to pursue criminal prosecutions. All that custom is there to support a system that is not entirely rational, except in a deep experiential way, but it has worked well. The problem now is that many, many of the underlying assumptions that make that very complicated system work have changed as a matter of reality. Much easier to identify leakers. Government may be more aggressive against them. Individuals who leak may leak enormous amounts of information, not just 11 volumes of the Pentagon Papers. And the information may be given to people who do not have the same professional standards and interest as the press. So Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have a very different agenda than the New York Times and the Washington Post. All of this raises the question, what is the system for today? What is the balance? Same one that we've had, or one that's different? This is one of the great, great questions of our time. Secondly, and lastly, and very quickly, if you think, as I do, that the greatest force that's going on in the world today are the forces of globalization, this is really globalization squared. Because we now have an interest not only in what's happening in this country, but all over the world, and therefore the Official Secrets Act is of importance to us. And the ways in which other governments use information or keep information or go after the press is every bit as important. It's no longer just human rights, important as that concept is. It's very practical information we need, and there are a lot of players other than the US government. So it's an extraordinary privilege to be part of this very distinguished group of people to close out this wonderful season of thinking about these issues that Emily Bell and the Tao Center had put together over this time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lee, for taking the time to be with us and for that thoughtful introduction. I'm Steve Coll. I'm the Dean of the Journalism School at Columbia, and I'm really thrilled that Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, Susan Glasser, executive editor or editor-in-chief of Politico, and Marty, the executive editor of the Washington Post, are here to talk about these issues as the last conversation in this year-long body of research and discourse that Emily's led. So with no further ado, I thought I'd start with a literal interpretation of the journalism after Snowden framework and ask you each a little bit about what it's like to practice national security reporting on the front lines in your experience over the last year or two. On the one hand, not a day goes by when the New York Times and the Washington Post don't have a scoop about classified information or a really significant piece of enterprise reporting that touches upon it. And at the same time, investigative reporters say that their sources are skittish, drying up, the work is harder than ever. Examples like Snowden and WikiLeaks suggest you can carry data out of the government in volumes that was unthinkable in the era of the Pentagon Papers, and yet the backlash of surveillance and prosecution from those leaks has made life difficult. So maybe starting with you, Dean, what's your net assessment of the national security reporting agenda today?
I would say first off that, this is going to sound odd, but leak reporting, I hate the phrase leak reporting because it implies the reporter passively receiving documents, but the way I define it, which is reporting using unidentified sources, is more important today than ever before. I would argue that much more warfare and foreign policy is going on in secret than any time in recent memory. I mean, the way warfare is conducted today, if you look at the places where the United States is engaged in some form or another, whether it's in Syria, a remaining engagement in Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, none of those things are declared wars. None of them are done following public discussion. They're all done through either secret arming of combatants or drones, and it is a tremendously, I mean, the secrecy of warfare has become, I think, one of the largest stories we cover. And therefore, I think there is much more tension between the press, which has to cover it. And by the way, it's also harder to cover it because it's hard to get reporters into those places. There's greater tension between the press that covers that and the government that doesn't want it covered. So I think that there's much more pressure on us to continue to cover those kinds of wars, but just we have to, so much of it is done in secret now.
And is it harder than it was 2 years ago to do that work?
It's much harder. Harder for a variety of reasons. First off, you could at least accompany your Washington national security reporting with reporting from the ground. I mean, you could do full, if you wanted to do, as we and the other editors here have done, if you wanted to do a portrait of how warlords work in Afghanistan or the inside workings of the Afghan government, you could combine a Washington reporter with an Afghan reporter. You've lost the ability in some of these, many instances, not in all, to use the Afghan reporter. So it's much harder. And meanwhile, I would say, without rambling on too much here, I think the government has not come to understand just how much the world has changed, and they can't keep this stuff secret anymore. I don't think they quite learned the lesson of Snowden. I mean, I still get, and I'm sure my colleagues here too, still get many requests from the government not to report stuff. I don't think they get that things have changed.
We'll come back to that subject. So Susan, you've been around this reporting for a long time as a reporter, as an editor at the Post, at Foreign Policy, now at Politico. Is there anything about the last couple of years, it's always been a struggle, it's never been easy work, but do you think in the last couple of years there are qualitative changes that you would identify?
Yeah, for sure. A couple observations. I mean, first of all, I think if you talk to any reporter who is working in this space right now, they will say there's just simply no question that in an already difficult environment, you have people who've now basically abandoned email, who, people who certainly in the past would have at least taken their phone call, engaged in a conversation. They don't want to do that. That's not just some sort of short-term skittishness. It fits, I think, into the big picture of this massive sort of complex of secret wars and the growth of secrecy. Think about, I was talking with someone today asking, what should I say on this panel? The insider threat program, which actually was a response not to Snowden, but to WikiLeaks. You now have basically big data looking for any triggers that might suggest, like say a reporter sent an email, even if you didn't reply to it, even if you didn't engage with it, that could be enough to trigger a whole official inquiry in effect. And I think people don't realize there's actually these sort of structural reasons for not the inability to communicate. And then there's just the bigger picture too, which is that it intersects, of course, with the politics of national security in the Obama administration. And I think that we shouldn't discount that either. All administrations, and there's a 200-year history you can do of using national security threats as a pretext for what are basically embarrassing political conversations or even uncomfortable political conversations. That's certainly been true, I think, to a very heightened degree with this administration, which how many times has President Obama, has the word Afghanistan even passed President Obama's lips? So, I think it's very hard when you're talking about the difficulty of reporting on the Obama administration to disentangle that from the very real consequences of the massive and large-scale security disclosures that have, in fact, been made in recent years. This is just, period, a very opaque and hard to penetrate White House. Its micromanagement of national security has been famously documented. David Sanger, who was on the previous panel, called it the least transparent White House and certainly in recent history. We did a poll last year and we asked White House reporters, how often do you talk to anyone in the White House on your beat, and this is their full-time job, who is not basically paid to talk to you, who's not in the communications office or the press office? 53% said, "Are you kidding me?" 53%. An additional 17% said once a week. Basically, that's extraordinary. What does that tell you? They're not talking to a single person except a person whose job it is to hold their hands. And I do think that's very relevant in this conversation.
Yeah, that's very powerful. But Marty, I come back to the paradox, and conceding my home team bias and acknowledging the juggernaut that is the Times' national security reporting. You've built, pound for pound, an incredible national security reporting team over the last few years. You put a lot of stuff into the paper, but do you feel that you are not able to understand what you're missing? I mean, do you feel like you've got a grip on this agenda, or that you're really afraid of what it is that we don't know anything about at all?
Right. Well, I think that we all we see is a tip of the iceberg for sure. The reporters are they do have sources. They do work the sources. I object to the characterization of these things as sort of leaks, as there's just some sort of agenda within the administration or within the national security apparatus to provide information to us, and then we go publish it. Many of these stories are the result of a lot of legwork on the part of the reporters. But they do have a hard time, as Dean and Susan have mentioned, of just having regular conversations with people. They have a hard time doing their beat. Forget about sort of secrets. Doing the ordinary course of reporting, because a lot of the people in the administration or in the military apparatus or anywhere within the executive branch are concerned that just by talking to reporters, they become a suspect if there is a leak investigation at a later date, simply because they have sort of fraternized or communicated in some way with national security reporters. That said, we all have good reporters, and they have developed sources over a period of time. It's their job to continue to develop those sources in every way possible. And they do continue to produce stories that are ones that the administration would prefer not to see published.
So Dean raised an issue I'm sure the audience is very interested in, which is the government pressing on editors like yourselves to withhold some or all of sensitive information that you come across. Start with you, Marty. What criteria do you use in judging what you might choose to withhold from the paper, whether it's under government pressure or voluntarily? And has that criteria changed at all over the last few years through your work with Snowden or otherwise?
You know, the criteria, it's hard to say that there are hard and fast criteria here. Obviously, we are very concerned about, and we do pay a lot of attention to publishing what are called sources and methods. We're not going to publish the names of agents overseas. We're going to try not to be too specific so that, that people will know exactly what the method is that's being used, perhaps by intelligence agencies. We're always willing to engage in a substantive conversation with the national security apparatus, with intelligence agencies about what their concerns are. We have a policy of actually listening, giving them time to make their case, going down there and having conversations with them, letting them know what we're going to publish before we do, so that there are no surprises. I think we do recognize that national security is a real concern, that there are reasons that the government may want to maintain secrets. But we also, what we try to look at from another point of view is, well, what is the public interest beyond national security? To what extent should the public be involved in the in decision making? To what extent should they know the kinds of things that their government is engaged in? And try to balance that against the government's desire to preserve secrets in the interests of what they characterize as national security. How to strike that balance? That is really difficult, as Lee mentioned in his introductory remarks. And ultimately, it comes down to our own judgment. And people can have faith in our judgment or not have faith in our judgment, but that's what it comes down to, is our own judgment as to what the proper balance is.
Dean, how would you describe your approach to that issue?
I would say, one thing I would say about Snowden, I think Snowden changed the rules because before Snowden, the national security focused on the actual policies, the actual, whether there were drone strikes in Afghanistan, what the CIA's role in managing a drone program was. The stories pre-Snowden focused on the secret warfare. Snowden made it so that the actual gathering of information became part of the story, and I think that got trickier for the government. It meant that you not only were jousting with the government over reporting the drone strike that killed Alaki, you were jousting with the government over methods, over methodology, which I think changed the dynamic considerably. And then I think when the President of the United States said that maybe Snowden had provoked a debate that the country should have had a long time ago, which is what he said, I think that made it so that whenever I got a call from the NSA or the CIA and we were about to report something, I would say it was very present for me that the President said, these are things the country should debate, so you really have to have a reason not to publish. I agree with Marty. My day in, day out standard is a request to withhold anything has to go through me. By the way, my experience, I don't know if Susan and Marty would agree, is that automatically knocks off half of them, because it knocks off the silly ones where the CIA PR guy wants to leave us out of a story a name that actually was in another story 2 weeks before in the Post or someplace else, and it's silly to hold it. So that knocks those off. And I insist that it comes from somebody of rank and beyond the press office. That sort of knocks out another. So that by the time they make their way to me, they usually are fairly serious requests. And I would agree with Marty that you do take seriously. I mean, I insist that they give me enough detail to prove that there's a true life or limb national security issue. I've dropped the ones, and I think the ones where I feel like I made mistakes early on were the requests when I now understand they didn't want to embarrass a partner. I sort of don't, those are sort of off the table mostly for me. I don't know if you guys.
I just wanted, if I could just interject here.
Yeah.
So, when Dean says the issue shifted from the policies to some extent to methods in the Snowden instance, it seems to me that the methods in the case of Snowden, they were the policy. That's the policy that you were concerned about, is that the level of surveillance that was so broad, so intrusive, that's the policy that we were grappling with.
Right.
And in order to talk about that policy, you actually had to discuss what those methods were.
You have to write about it.
Now,
Right.
in discussing those methods, there's a level of detail. You can go into every detail, or you can go into some detail. We went fairly deep in detail, but we didn't go as deep as we could have gone with the detail.
And we'll look forward to reading your memoir when you write in detail about your interactions with the government after you acquired the Snowden materials. But
He does a nightclub show where
does
he
he?
describes.
Okay, yeah. But can you give us a flavor of the quality of your interactions with the government around the Snowden material? Was it hostile? Did it start hostile and become constructive? Did you end up feeling satisfied that both sides were heard, even though you exercised the judgment that you so well described a moment ago?
I feel good about our interactions because I've had government officials tell me afterwards that they thought that we were responsible, notwithstanding the enormous volume of information that we disclosed, and the fact that they were very upset that we did that. In the end, people told me that they thought that we had been responsible in what we chose to publish and what we chose not to publish, and the degree to which we listened to what they had to say. So, for them to say that, I think is some sort of testament to reasonably good judgment on our part for them to say that at this stage. The interactions were, I wasn't not personally involved in every interaction. I was involved in one in particular, but and it was kind of hostile. It was a high-level official, and he described broad categories that they did not want us to discuss. And I said, well, can you offer more detail about what your concerns are? And the response was, I just did. And I had to say, well, a little bit more detail would be helpful than what you've outlined for me here. And but we had people like Bart Gellman and Greg Miller and other reporters have sat with large numbers of intelligence officials at one time in many instances. I think that Greg Miller sat with maybe 16 people from a wide variety of intelligence agencies, all by himself, describing in detail what the story would say and listening to their objections. And we're willing to do that, and we're willing to listen, and we don't want them to be surprised by what's going to be published. And we're willing to spend a lot of time going fact by fact, detail by detail through the stories. And then we come to a decision. Ultimately, the decision is ours, and we're willing to make that. We're willing to make that decision. It is. I mean, I think that people think that we take very lightly these national security concerns. I don't. I'm a citizen of the United States, like others. I have to be concerned about national security like everyone else, but I'm also concerned about the public interest. I'm concerned about our democracy, and I'm concerned about secret government, and I'm concerned about other things as well. And you try to balance all. You try to balance all of that. Ultimately, you say, what does it mean to be an American? And yes, it means you want to be safe, but it means more than that. It means certain a level of participation on the part of the public in their own government, and accountability of the government as well to the people.
So, Susan, you're entering into responsibilities that will bring you to these conversations. You probably participated in some of them, so I'd welcome thoughts you have about that. But I also wanted to go back to this very interesting way you described the closed system of the Obama administration, because you sort of connected the observation that they are the most closed administration since the Second World War, I would imagine, certainly in a long time, to the the structure of the national security state, the surveillance state, in an interesting way. But even before Snowden or WikiLeaks, they were a pretty tough nut to crack. So how do you explain the political success, at least at the presidential cycle, that they've been able to connect with this closed system? Is it a model for the coming presidencies that we're all going to deal with essentially an imperial communications system that doesn't feel that it needs to deal with the public or the press in the way previous administrations did?
I hope not. No, I think I'm glad you brought it back to that. Dean made the point that's a really important point about almost the sort of absurd contradictions of, on the one hand, President Obama saying this is an important conversation. On the other hand, I was rereading your recent excellent article in the New Yorker about our drone war in Pakistan, and you have a situation where actually the administration was not legally saying that it was entitled to even discuss drones, to use the word. There was a great scene in there, right, of the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan basically screaming and saying, we can't even talk about this, and this is, of course, really hampering his ability to operate diplomatically in the country. And this went on for a period of years, that we were conducting a large-scale secret war in Pakistan that actually escalated dramatically with the advent of from the change from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And so you have this incredible sort of contradiction at the heart of this national security conversation. On the one hand, it's front page news. It's the subject of robust policy debates, never mind national security type reporting. On the other hand, you have a situation where you don't have your interlocutors in the United States government are being told that legally they're not even allowed to acknowledge the existence of this program. So I think that's very relevant. That's true with the drone situation. It's true with many of the programs, of course, that were reported in the Snowden thing. Even WikiLeaks. Remember, there was an outcry after WikiLeaks, and many of these cables were not the most sensitive classified cables. They were, most of them were a lesser degree of classification. State Department employees were told that they could even lose their jobs to discuss the contents of which were easily available.
They weren't allowed to read them in many
Absolutely. They weren't even allowed to read them, and yet, they were toppling governments in Tunisia. At the same time, they weren't allowed to mention it. So I think this is relevant. And then the other point I wanted to make was that, of course, this concerns journalism, and it concerns the public's right to know. It concerns, our ability to navigate without some kind of clear-cut legal standard what we're doing. But this wrangle has also occurred even between the branches of government. And I think if you look at this real unusual, almost war that had broken out between Congress and the White House over some of these very same issues of, was the administration actually being forthright and honest in its disclosure to the Congressional Intelligence Committees. And I think that's very relevant because it suggests that, it's not just some sort of tired, journalists, of course, are always going to demand more access, that there's something, right, I think, qualitatively different going on here. Almost certainly it does have to do with the massive escalation of this security state in the decade and a half since September 11th.
Great. So let me shift a little bit and ask another kind of literal version about, literal question about journalism after Snowden. So suppose I were a crack young graduate of the Columbia Journalism School, specialized in investigative reporting, which, by the way, there are many, and you hired me. And I came in, Dean, and I said, boss, give me the locker room speech. I want to do national security reporting. I'm really glad to be a junior member of your team. What do you want to know about? What wall can I scale? What subjects matter to you most looking at the reporting agenda for the next 6 to 12 months?
I would say, and I say this in the Bureau to the people who work in the Bureau now, so I would certainly say it to a young, up-and-coming reporter, there is more significant national security policy being done in secret right now than at any time in memory. If you think about where the United States is engaged and what we don't know about it, how little of it has been debated in public, it's stunning. I don't think that we have. I don't think we have any full handle on what day-to-day warfare was in Afghanistan for a long time, and what that looked like. We know that there was house-to-house warfare. I think we have no idea what that looked like. I don't think we have a full handle on, and every good news organization has taken cuts at drone warfare and what it looks like. I don't think anybody has a handle on how frequent, what the bases look like, just the whole. I don't think we have any handle on how much U.S. involvement there is in Africa. I think that even the national security stories that are sort of the daily life of national security scoops in all of our publications that get people really excited, or you can tell they're the thinnest things. They're debates about how much aid and what kind of aid should go to a combatant, and whether they should get night vision goggles. So I would say to a young reporter, this not only now, I think the combination of the dramatic increase in technology that led to drones, that led to dramatic increases in surveillance, and the fact that most warfare is now conducted, or much of warfare is conducted against stateless combatants, has led to just sort of undeclared, undiscussed, undiscovered stuff all over the world. I just think it's like the giant story of our time in terms of national security.
Marty?
Well, to be somewhat more specific, I mean, I would think that perhaps the most interesting is the area of cyber warfare. And I think it is going to be huge. I think the consequences of it are enormous. There are players on the world scene who are capable of engaging in it who don't have nuclear weapons but can cause enormous damage as a result of it. We have huge vulnerabilities in our own society in just about every area. There was just an IG report in the Energy Department about the Energy Department officials themselves releasing information that they should not have released, that exposed huge vulnerabilities in the electrical system in the United States, which is notoriously vulnerable even to physical attack. Forget about cyber attack. But that is an area, as we could see from the Sony case and the hacking of J.P. Morgan and others, there are huge capabilities. And the players don't have to be state players. They can be individuals and crime syndicates and all sorts of entities which we have not even identified. And to me, that's one of the most terrifying areas, and certainly an area for a novice reporter, if he or she wants to make a name for himself, could actually become quite an expert in.
She, in the case of the Columbia Journalism School, we're 3/4 women. Just thought I'd try that out.
That's great.
Susan.
The next thing you're going to be giving me names.
Yes, exactly.
Well, the real truth is she's not going to get a job, investigating things for either of them. So when she comes to work for me, we'll sit down and we'll map out a very ambitious plan. A couple thoughts. One, bring it back here to Washington for a second. I mean, what does it mean to have this explosion of a secret government apparatus to run all these secret wars? And I could name 6 other countries, to add to Dean's list for sure, including, by the way, Syria, which is not exactly some obscure theater, and we know very little actually about, what have we really done in Jordan and Syria and Turkey over the last 3 years. And I think that's very important actually to understanding what went so wrong. But to bring it back to Washington, I would say, that Dana Priest took a good crack at this a few years ago, but mapping this sort of archipelago of government agencies that no one has ever even heard of. Talk about lack of transparency. At least we know the phone number at the White House. We're talking about agencies whose functions are beyond opaque, and yet I think there are ways to crack into that that we should all be training more investigative resources on. These are government-funded agencies about whom perhaps there's been that one article, perhaps not anything else since, and that seems like a natural subject.
Interesting. So just to shift again and talk a little bit about the conduct of sensitive reporting, investigative reporting in the age of surveillance. The earlier panel included a presentation by Pew of a survey of IRE reporters, 670 of them, asking how many of them have changed their digital security practices over the last year. Some had, but many had not. And the range of activities that investigative reporters, even those working on national security subjects, were undertaking is very eclectic and reflected an absence of resources and policy, and just how difficult it is to find a uniform approach. So I wanted to ask, start with you, Marty. In the handbook, when a new reporter comes in, there's a lot that you would take for granted at the Washington Post. You don't misrepresent yourself. You don't talk about confidential sources at the water cooler, a lot of things that barely need articulation. But is there a moment arising now where a newsroom leader like yourself has to think about uniform approaches to digital security, metadata? When is encryption called for, or is it ever called for? Or do you see that really as a function of reporters finding their own way with perhaps some institutional expertise on the side? And has the experience of managing the Snowden documents changed your view of those subjects?
Well, I mean, I think for certain kinds of reporters, it's something that we need to make routine. Certainly, use of encryption probably has to become routine knowledge for reporters who are working in the area of national security. I don't think it always has been. I think that people who are working in that field now know that it does have to be. I mean, when we were working on the Snowden documents, pretty much a lot of the communication with Bart Gellman was encrypted. Then the New York Times ran a story saying that they had broken most of the encryption codes, and I said, Bart, can we stop using this encryption thing now? And Bart said, no, I don't think they've broken this one yet, so we still had to use it. So, but I think that people do need to have to learn that. I'm also particularly concerned about reporters who are overseas, because many of the reporters who are working in regions where there are predominantly autocratic governments which have surveillance states of their own, I think we're woefully unprepared for the monitoring that will take place and probably already does take place of their reporting. And I'm not sure entirely what to do about that, but I think that we have to take certainly further steps than we've taken to date to protect our own reporters.
Dean, any thoughts you have about this? But also, I was obviously both you and the Washington Post now serve global audiences. The Times is increasingly a global news organization. You come under attack, according to public sources, from multiple directions, sometimes over relatively minor pieces of reporting, sometimes over major projects that you've undertaken. When you make decisions about the safety of your colleagues, you have to take into account a global system now. So how do you approach both the defense, the protection of the integrity of your information and your colleagues, and then also the management of security, given that, as Marty says, the surveillance is not just coming from the NSA?
Well, I agree with Marty that and I think we're talking about national security reporters. I mean, I'm not surprised that the IRE survey showed what it showed, because I'm not sure if you're an Albany investigative reporter, you have to, well, maybe I'm wrong, but if you're, especially in Albany, but if you're in Albany, I'll pick another city.
You might be wise, yeah.
In fact, I'm going to get on the phone after this and call Albany. I think you're talking about in the area of national security, and I think there's an extraordinary paranoia, whether it's the people who cover the CIA who no longer do their work on the phone and meet people in person. There's a tremendous amount of communication that's encrypted. We do find the more we do sort of broad international, we in the last 2 or 3 years we've done 2 or 3 and have more in the works that are sort of broadly international stories. The China stuff we did, some of the Russia stuff we did this year, and you actually don't. In none of those cases did we ever not report something because the governments insisted that we not report, and even to our, in the case of China, it damaged us. Our site has been down ever since. We do have our lawyers scrutinize stories in particular. There's some countries where if a story runs in the country, you have a different kind of legal liability. You also have, to be frank, a different kind of danger for your reporters. I mean, that's the most nervous-making issue for me. If you're going to write a story that's a pretty deeply reported piece about Pakistan, I think you really want to make sure you have conversations with the reporters, even if the reporters aren't involved in it. Those give me more pause, actually, than the concerns about the governments, the safety of the reporters, the safety of local reporters, especially in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But that gives me more pause about stories than anything else.
What about the experience of being subject to this kind of vandalism and hacking from proxy groups, some of it skilled and purposeful, some of it malicious and random? That's something new under the sun.
It is. It is, and it makes us more. I'm not sure whenever it happens, and I'm sure this is true at Marty and Susan's shops too. We have these discussions and we talk about what security measures we can put in place, and I think almost always we conclude not a whole lot. Whether it's the alleged Syrian group that takes down sites. I mean, we go to our tech departments, and I don't think there's a whole lot. This is to Marty's point about cyber warfare being one of the scariest new kinds of warfare. Not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot you can do, to be frank.
Have you reached that conclusion?
I hope not, but I think I'm close to it. We've been hacked as well, presumably by the Chinese, just as the New York Times has been, and I think there's an assumption on our part that if a determined hacker could probably find a way into the system, there are enough vulnerabilities as there is with any system. Today we had the report, or late yesterday, the report about Anthem health insurance being hacked and people getting access to health information, and every week or so we hear of another major hack. And JP Morgan, which I mentioned before, and banks tend to have some of the tightest computer security of any institution out there. We think that our safeguards are good, that they're as good as they can be, but no safeguards are complete, and the U.S. government itself has not been able to safeguard all of its information, and that's a huge concern in terms of being able to get access to the communications of our reporters with individuals around the world, in the country. Their ability to disrupt systems is a concern. There are a whole range of concerns, and it's not just the Chinese. It could be, as I said before, any entity out there, including ones that we would not even have imagined.
Mm-hmm. Susan, have you had any encounters with this at Politico that have led you to think about, particularly the last thing Marty said? I mean, it's one thing, every institution that stores electronic information is vulnerable to the release of devastating invasions of personal privacy through health records and other subjects. There is a distinctive body of information related to journalistic practice, source confidentiality, source communications, that seems implicated by this age of vandalism. I've never thought about it before, but I wonder if there isn't a need to think about special practices to try to identify and isolate information of that character.
Well, I think, in the Sony hack is probably the most sort of recent attention-getting one that suggests a whole different way of thinking about the vulnerability of this massive just ream of, everyday sensitive corporate communications as a way to attack a company. I think that that's part of what got people's attention so much. I think this is where the national security and the political conversations haven't fully matched up yet, and there's a sense that, we live almost in this oasis of, the First Amendment when it comes to sort of how Washington and politics is. But to get to Lee's point and, before, which is, this is an oasis. It is a really, we're sort of deluding ourselves about how global all these institutions, including Politico, have become, both at Politico and at Foreign Policy, in addition to at the Washington Post, where I was actually the Russia correspondent. One of the sets of actors on the global stage who are most aggressive in the use of other people's speech laws are Russian oligarchs, for example, and they have very skilled in the ways of understanding where they have opportunities in Great Britain or in Dubai to send threatening letters to publications because they now appear on the internet. Think about this in the current political context with Russia. It's one thing, when you're operating in Russia itself, that poses a threat to the correspondent. In many ways, it's reminiscent almost of returning to Cold War practices. Best practices of the 1970s are relevant again when it comes to actually operating in Moscow in terms of not using email or having conversations in person. Even when we worked there in the early 2000s, those habits had not entirely died, and of course it is more time-consuming, but it is less secure, and it doesn't involve encryption to talk to somebody in a park or cafe, and those traditions had persisted in Russia on the one hand. On the other hand, the scale of communication and the ability to retaliate and the globalization of the Russian elite into the world order have given them tools that show up now at a place like Politico, at a place like Foreign Policy Magazine in Washington, which have become accustomed to receiving legal threats around our free speech. We're not sitting there making decisions about what to publish based on the national interests of Russia, but it's become a whole different kind of threat to speech. And now you have the United States government, the not super opaque United States government issuing round after round of sanction against Russian companies and senior government officials in the wake of Ukraine, and not releasing extensive detail about what those sanctions are based upon, for example. So you can get entangled in both countries' national security debates as you decide what to publish and on what basis you know this information.
Right, that was the kind of framework of globalization we talked about earlier. All right, well, let's open up to the audience, and I'm not sure under these bright lights where I will find people who have a microphone. There's someone handing out microphones, and I think that's the kind of critical piece. So raise your hands to that gentleman who is raising his hand. And please identify yourself if you.
Hi, my name is George Mapp. I have a question to the editors. Has there ever been, what's the protocol or practice? For instance, there's something that maybe agency says, please don't release it because it's very sensitive or classified. And I'll just give it a little example to give color. For instance, Raymond Davis was working for the Special Activities Division of the CIA. And, first they announced that he was working for the U.S. Embassy and the State Department. And it wasn't released right away that he worked for CIA because they were worried about his safety in Pakistan. But one paper released it. So say one of you guys hold it back and then someone else releases it. Is it fair game?
Okay, it's a good question.
And then the second part,
maybe one part per person,
Okay.
Since we've got a lot of folks
Not
here.
a problem.
I actually was involved in I was the Washington bureau chief when the Raymond Davis story broke, so I was involved in the decision. And the details, which I can remember right, so for those who don't know the Raymond Davis case, he shot a bunch of people in the street. He was picked up by Pakistani authorities, put in jail, and for the first day or two, the U.S. was desperate for people not to know he was a CIA contractor. I think he may have been described as I can't remember whether he was described as an embassy employee or it was USAID. So there was a pretty ferocious debate in our newsroom. The government, and this was not what they called every newsroom, and said, could you leave out the fact that he's a CIA contractor? And I actually thought in that case that the argument was compelling for a brief time. I mean, I knew it would come out, but I thought the very first day when he was in a Pakistani jail, and their argument was if he's in a Pakistani jail and everybody knows he's a CIA operative, something bad's going to happen to him. I thought for the first day, that was, and then everybody after the second or third day. I try not to be too influenced by what everybody else does. I mean, I know sometimes that's silly. If the Washington Post, says the guy's a CIA operative or says something else, it feels quaint to not do it. But I guess I try to stick to my guns that we are not gonna, I mean, you can't do this forever, but that you have to have your own rules, your own determinations, and you have to just stick to your guns. After a certain period of time, if everybody reports it and it's...
I think it was The Guardian that broke it first, wasn't it?
I think it was The Guardian that broke it. And the argument that everybody made was that the local Pakistani press was saying he was a CIA operative, a CIA employee. And I think I actually bought the argument in that case, again, for like a day or two. I bought the argument in that case that that it was one thing for the Pakistani press, which is not particularly reliable and is filled with rumors, but I think that if a major American news organization had said it, and I don't think that for the first day or two anybody did, and then after like the third day, everybody did.
It does raise a larger question that's been around for a long time in all of your careers, which is maybe been amplified by the digital and globalized environment to a degree where it might have changed quality. But when the National Enquirer reports something, does that become an excuse to note that National Enquirer has reported something? Back in the analog days, editors like you would tend to say, no, that's not enough. But then what's the degree of legitimacy to other people's reporting that leads it into the public domain, and your judgment changes the context in which you make your decision? So Marty, how do you deal with that?
Well, I guess the honest answer to the question is I'm not entirely sure. Everything is situational. I mean, there's a lot of room here for judgment and case by case, and you'll often see statements coming from any of us up here and others that we evaluate every case individually, and that's another way of saying we're not entirely sure. We'll just have to see what the circumstances are and how do we feel about it. And I think generally, I mean, I feel as Dean does that we have our standards. We should stick to our standards. We shouldn't be influenced by what somebody else does if we feel that those aren't the proper standards. On the other hand, that can seem absurd in some instances, and if the information is already out there, if it's accepted as a fact, if it's documented, then what are you supposed to do? And you can be stubborn and stick to your standards, or you can just acknowledge reality. And then that leads you to, well, we know that other people are going to report this, and what do we do now? And again, my answer to that is, I don't know. I'll wait and see how I feel about it at the time. And frankly, a lot of decisions in our field come down to let's just make a decision and see how we all feel about it at that particular moment. And I realize that's an incredibly unsatisfying answer, and it doesn't lead to good lessons at Columbia Journalism School about how do you deal with these things, these case studies that you do about, okay, here's how they thought this through. It's just, in some instances, you kind of go with your gut, and that's what it boils down to.
And then you get this. Then you get that. I'm sure this is. Then you get this. The slightly sloppy ones where the answer gets accidentally made for you. You're having a. I don't mean the large Snowden national security stories, but you're ready to have a full body debate whether to link to something or put something up, and it happens at 9 o'clock and somebody just does it.
Right.
and then it's too late.
Or somebody on the staff didn't get the message that we're not publishing this
Yes,
just yet.
that's
It's been
right.
posted.
No, that's right.
It's been posted on the web, and then you get a call from Politico saying, why did you choose to publish that information at that particular point?
Well, but Politico is an interesting beast because it's got this great reporting-based, old-school metabolism that sometimes feels like a really kind of exciting throwback to the competitive newspaper age, and it's moving fast by design. That's kind of at least my reading of the culture in part, and it does a lot of enterprise as well. But does the speed by which you measure your competitive effectiveness at Politico seem different from what you were wrestling with when you were editing politics on the national desk of the Post or even at Foreign Policy?
You know, I mean, I think these guys would say that the world has speeded up and that,
Yep.
our metabolism isn't any different at this point than anyone else's, and that, in some ways, efficiency, authoritativeness, and accuracy have become the new speed in many ways. We all have Twitter, and we just saw that just the other day. We all saw that on Friday when, not one but multiple news organizations, none of these three were reporting that Mitt Romney was going to for sure run for president again. And, I bring that up because actually I was like, it's January of 2015, are we going to live with this for 2 years? First of all, it could happen to any of us, right? Like Marty's story is certainly true. Like, it's very hard even within your own organization to have some sort of unified decision-making and policy, but now you're living in a world where it's not just some random blog or tweet or whatever, but the speed and metabolism of all other even reliable news organizations is such that we're forced to move in a way, and we have to make even more constant judgments. Not like we've set a standard, or that my guess is that anybody set a standard for, okay, this is the kind of news and that we publish, and even if other people have it, we don't publish it. We're all reinventing that standard more or less day by day. We want to be authoritative and accurate. I'm sure everybody here was very happy that we were authoritative and accurate, as it turned out, as well as being fast with with the correct story. But the more important thing is that it gives you a headache to think about. That is the level of decision making that you're now operating with,
Right,
and
yes.
that it's not enough to say, well, of course we're all going to aggregate a little bit in this new environment, and we're going to do this reporting. You have to, on the one hand, you want to stick to your own guns. You want to trust your own reporters and your own judgment, because that's why you have a brand like the New York Times, and that's the value on some level that you're providing to people. But then you could risk looking like President Obama and his drone war. On the one hand, he's in favor of it. On the other hand, he's not legally supposed to talk about it.
Right.
Didn't he have to declassify the existence of the drone program in order to give one of his speeches?
He did, and fortunately, presidents can do that on their own. You didn't have to file a FOIA.
We should have that power.
You didn't have
Don't
to
we
file a
agree? We
FOIA.
should be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm looking for the person with the microphone. I see hands, and I see someone waving who possesses a microphone.
So just on the subject, pardon?
Can-
Daniel Stuckey, I'm independent. But just on the subject of let's hold this for later and accommodating intelligence agency officers that cite a risk of, national security. I was curious about any kind of examples or experiences in which those citations were made of national security and accommodations were made by organizations that led to, I guess it's about the shelf life of those accommodations, how long they've lasted, if any of them have lasted for a long time that you can recall.
We have accommodations that we made in the Snowden disclosures that last till this day that we haven't published, and we don't intend to publish. We were convinced that they would in fact jeopardize national security, that they might give away certain sources and methods that would be irreplaceable and that were absolutely vital. And they were not, and I should say that they were not central to the thrust of the story, and we could tell the story and it could make its point without revealing those details. So there were many of those kinds of things that we withheld and that we continue to withhold and that we have no intention of publishing at any point. So that's a judgment that we made, and I think it's I personally believe that that's a sound judgment.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Tara McKelvey, and I work for the BBC. I'm the White House reporter. And I went to the CIA yesterday, and I'd love to hear more about how you manage that relationship. You know, you say no, that I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to publish this story that we want to publish. Don't they get mad at you? And then you say that you explain, or Greg Miller explains to them in detail about what you're going to publish, and then you make a decision. And I'm wondering how that works, because I thought I wasn't supposed to tell people what I'm going to publish beforehand. So, and I understand what you mean, but I just want you to explain a little bit more.
You know, we don't. No, I don't think I'm with Marty. Nobody says no. I mean, you wouldn't do that with anybody you will write it. You wouldn't. I mean, when I say you, even if it's not the CIA, any institution you write about, you take your allegations, your information to the institution. In the case of writing about intelligence, you do show them, or not, I don't know about show them, that gets complicated, but you do tell them the information they're going to use that you know is going to, it might raise national security issues. You hear them out. I don't think we care that much if they're mad at us. I really don't. I think the CIA is sort of mad at everybody right now. But you go through it, and I thought Marty's description, and it's the same with WikiLeaks. It was the same with Snowden. It's the same with daily national security reporting. You go through. My story's going to say this. It's going to say these 5 or 6 very specific things, and you hear them out if they want to say these 2 are, and here's why. You push them hard for the detail. You have to get detail that satisfies you if you make a decision, and you sit in your office with the reporters and you make a decision.
Yep.
They get mad at us, and we get mad at them, so it's equal.
I've had instances, by the way, in which they've later said. I also have had instances where the CIA will not want something reported, and when you take it, you insist that it go to the White House. The White House says, that's actually not that important to us, because they're looking at things more broadly sometimes than the CIA.
Although I've also had instances where it was the reverse too.
Yes, yes.
Where other government agencies were more willing to publish.
And of course, these agencies are not monoliths. Different individuals are in the decision-making positions over time, and they handle their position in this interaction with wildly different degrees of sophistication.
Right.
And you're on the phone with the groups of them sometimes, because they'll bring in the lawyers for each division, and nobody wants to give you their name. So you're sort of on the phone with all of these guys who sound generally alike, whose names are like Mike.
I would just say, I want them to tell us their concerns prior to publication, because I'd rather know what those concerns are prior to publication than to have them revealed to me after publication. So I want to go in with full knowledge. It's fine if they have the knowledge of that there isn't a surprise about what we're going to publish, and I too don't want to be surprised that there is a concern that was held within about national security that I didn't know because I didn't ask, and because we didn't ask the right question and we weren't specific enough. I do want to know. It should factor into my decision-making process, or our decision-making process, factor into my judgment. I may not be able to make the proper judgments if I don't have full knowledge.
Great. Looking for help where the microphone is. There it is.
I have a question about the James Risen case. So in the end, he was not asked to testify, but his source has been convicted of espionage. What kind of precedent do you think that the government is making by letting James Risen off the hook, but still sort of going after his source so aggressively?
Boy, I don't know. It's such a sloppy, weird. It's such a sloppy, weird, inchoate case that they pursued. I mean, it's obviously I'm outraged they pursued Risen, and that they went after his source. But it's such an odd, anticlimactic ending that they. I mean, I'm heartened that they didn't push Jim to actually have to testify. I don't know that the government has given us any inkling that they wouldn't push hard if a case came up like this again. I think they went a lot farther than any of us thought. We kept waiting. Right after the election, we always assumed that, and got all these hints that the case would be dropped once the Obama administration came in. It never got dropped. It went up right up to the last minute. I mean, he ended up in a courtroom, though he didn't say anything. So I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure what to make of the Risen case.
I mean, I would say that I think if there's a precedent that's of consequence, it's the precedent that it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not come down in Jim Risen's favor.
Right.
So if this administration or subsequent administration wants to pursue this all the way, they certainly could, and that to me is the most consequential thing. I mean, I think it's terrific that in the end the administration did not call him to testify at least on his source, and I'm relieved for him. He's a friend of mine and a former colleague of mine, and I'm relieved for our profession. But it's not a victory that will necessarily last for very long.
And of course, sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, of course, Jeffrey Sterling, who was the person convicted at trial, like John Kiriakou before him, was essentially convicted on metadata about his communications with a reporter and prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And it may be more of a question for editorial pages than for newsroom editors, but it's a little bit uncomfortable that the victory of Risen's, of the Justice Department's backing off, comes at the expense of a series of draconian espionage prosecutions of individuals in the government engaging in really a form of professional reporting from our perspective.
No, that was going to be my point, was that I think it is important to say that it's much easier for the government in many ways. They have much more levers over their own employees than they do over journalists. Journalists can join hands, and there is certainly a broad support for the First Amendment as it applies to them. So, the real chilling effect, of course, is the tools that the government brings to bear on its own employees in the wake of this. And then there is also the sort of broader international consequence, the foreign policy consequence. It was not lost on people that, who did you have doing live stand-ups outside of the Risen trial? Russia Today, who has been the biggest promoter of Edward Snowden. Of course it's been his refuge in Moscow, where he's a celebrity, and I think it does undermine, the U.S. position in the world to be occasionally, for free speech, except when we're against it.
I see the microphone back there.
Steve Winters. I wonder if particularly the Times and the Post if you could give us some insight into where you think the story of the Snowden revelations is going to go as we move forward. And the reason I ask that is because this tranche of documents that was published by Der Spiegel just a few weeks ago actually got Der Spiegel under attack in Germany, for instance, by the Bild Zeitung, for having Jacob Appelbaum as one of the people who prepared that material. Only a small percentage, apparently, of Snowden's material has been made public. So and Snowden is everywhere to be seen by video links. The story doesn't seem to be dying. So you personally, where do you see this going forward next year, the year after?
You go.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's true that perhaps a relatively small percentage of the documents that he gained access to were released, but not all the documents are necessarily of great consequence either. So the pace of disclosures has slowed considerably. It comes episodically, and I would say that the magnitude of those disclosures has diminished over time. So I would imagine that would be the trajectory over the next several years, something like that. So.
I would agree with that. I mean, to give you an idea of how enormous the Snowden and all these caches, the WikiLeaks documents, which have been not only hashed over by half a dozen big news organizations, nobody's gone through all of them. I mean, you go through more of them when the way it worked, you go through, there are 10 or 15 stories that are sort of on the front burner, right? when those documents were first released, Afghanistan and Pakistan were the big stories. Everybody milked everything about Afghanistan and Pakistan. I don't, so ISIS was not even, the leaders of ISIS were not even names at the top of our minds. So now people will go in again and look for those. So, but I agree with Marty, though. It's enormous. Nobody's gone through all of it. A huge percentage of it is just sort of mundane, too, though.
And WikiLeaks is an interesting comparison because the Times in particular played an important role as kind of interlocutor between the WikiLeaks sources and public, trying to filter for public interest, trying to comb out operational detail and other unnecessary material.
And WikiLeaks went along with the stuff we took out.
And they kind of honored your role
Right.
in that respect. And then in the end, the entire archive was dumped
Right.
into the public domain. Is it conceivable, Marty, that such an outcome could follow in the Snowden matter, or do you feel confident that the press's role, which Snowden has enshrined, in making these very kind of case law judgments about what goes out and what doesn't, will be preserved?
Well, I don't know what my level of confidence is. He has said that he wanted the press to make these kinds of judgments, and that ultimately he trusted in the judgments that we would make. He didn't trust in the judgment of only one press institution. He trusted presumably in the judgment of multiple institutions, and so what becomes of it? How it? Let's say, could it just be turned over to WikiLeaks and everything is out there at some point? Certainly within the realm of possibility. He's indicated, as I understand it, that that's not what he's going to do. It isn't what he's done to date, and it's been quite a period of time. So I think it's unlikely, but is it impossible? Obviously not.
Can I add one thing about WikiLeaks that's unrelated to all of this? But sometimes when when the press talks about the things we hold back, because the things we choose not to publish, I think people are confused about what that kind of stuff is because we can't publish it because we chose not to. But because so much time has passed with WikiLeaks, there's an example I use of one that I thought was a classic case in which every news organization involved, and it was the Times, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, and then Julian Assange himself, agreed to withhold. And it just sort of gives you a flavor of the nuts and bolts stuff. There was a remarkable cable. Gaddafi was about to visit the United States. And it was this remarkably detailed State Department cable in preparation for his visit that described how he traveled with a group of young nurses. Ukrainian nurses, good memory. He traveled with a group of Ukrainian nurses, how they wanted to make sure that wherever he stayed didn't have stairs because the leader gets out of breath after he goes up 2 stairs. What he needed to have in his room. It was an amazingly detailed document. And when we read it, we thought, this one we're just going to make a separate story all by itself and box it. So the government said, look carefully at that document and look at the kinds of people it mentions who know this stuff. Now, isn't it pretty clear who the source is? And it actually was. If you read the document, it was without going into detail, it was clearly somebody in his very small inner circle. Gaddafi, remember, was still alive at the time and in power. So the government said, if you publish that, don't you think that person who provided all of that detailed information, including the fact that the leader is out of shape and can't go up more than 2 stairs, what do you think is going to happen to that person? And all of us, Der Spiegel, The Guardian, Assange, everybody thought that was a completely reasonable argument. We didn't use the cable. I think that it's so unusual for us to be able to offer a case study in the kinds of stuff we withhold, and that's the kind of stuff that's clearly a life and limb issue.
So,
Knowing Dean, you have to be awfully persuasive for him not to publish a story that includes young nurses in it.
so we've been up here almost an hour and a half. I feel aware of what a great privilege it is to have three such distinguished and active and influential editors talking so candidly and with such nuance about these subjects. So I'm really grateful to all three of you for making the time for this. Please give them a round of applause.